It is the land far to the east of Middle-earth, a land where the earliest peoples would awaken, and the Dark Lord would focus his early efforts on corrupting them. In time, these lands would be home not only to men and elves, but also to 4 clans of the dwarves, 3 of the wizards, and creatures unique to the east. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the history of Rhûn. In the early days of the world, specifically the years of the trees 1050, the elves awake in the far east at Cuiviénen. We are told Cuiviénen is 450 miles east or southeast of the future location of the Sea of Rhûn, and that it lies on the east side of the Sea of Helkar. While many elves would make the great journey west, there are some, called the Avari elves, who remain in the east. It is believed that some of these Avari elves were corrupted by Melkor in ancient days, becoming the race of orcs. We are told some of the Avari would eventually wander westward, though this implies there are also some who would remain in the east. 450 years of the trees later, roughly 4,311 of our own years, these lands look completely different, as we are told Cuiviénen had been lost to time, and these lands look much closer to what we see in later ages. It is here the first men awake in the far eastern land of Hildorien, in year 1 of the First Age. As covered in my Houses of the Edain video, the ancestors of the men in the First Age tales travel west, and meet both the Avari elves and another race of being living in the east, dwarves. The 7 fathers of the dwarves awake sometime between the awakening of the elves and the awakening of men. 2 dwarf fathers, those of the Firebeards and Broadbeams, would awake in the Blue Mountains in the west, founding Nogrod and Belagost. Durin, the father of the Longbeards, would awake in Mount Gundabad in the north, and travel south to found Khazad-dûm. The remaining 4, the fathers of the Iron Fists, Stiffbeards, Blacklocks, and Stonefoots, are said to have awakened in the east. The only clue we are given to the location of the hulls of the Rhûn dwarves is that they were as far or farther from the Misty Mountains as Mount Gundabad was from the Blue Mountains. When the men migrating westward encountered the dwarves, it is said that some among the dwarves had fallen under the shadow and were of evil mind and distrustful of the men. While many of these men would move on to Beleriand and become the 3 houses of the Edain, some men would remain in the lands of Rhûn, becoming the people we know as the Easterlings. It's not only men, elves, and dwarves that would be found in Rhûn. Tolkien also tells us of beasts that were unique to the region. Some are very real and believable, others are extraordinary and perhaps even mythical. First, we have the Kine of Araw, which are a species of oxen that live in the fields near the Sea of Rhûn. They are said to have been hardier and wilder than any other breed of oxen in Middle-earth, and stories claim that they were descended from the cattle of Orome the Hunter, as evidenced by the fact that Araw is the Sindarin form of Orome's name. These creatures would have a direct connection to one of the members of the Fellowship of the Ring. For Boromir's ancestor Vorondil, who lived 1,000 years earlier, would hunt the Kine of Araw, and it was from one of their horns that he would fashion the Great Horn, which would be passed down the line of the Stewards of Gondor all the way to Boromir. Another creature unique to Rhûn is debatable whether it ever truly existed. These are the wereworms. There is but a single reference to these creatures. In The Hobbit, Bilbo says, "Tell me what you want done, and I will try it if I have to walk from here to the east of East and fight the wild wereworms in the last desert." Thus, we are left to speculate completely as to what these wereworms were like, and whether they did in fact exist, or were merely a mythical creature of Hobbit legend. Just as he had done with the elves, Morgoth personally travels to the lands of the East, working to corrupt its inhabitants to his will. Many Easterlings would come under the dominion of the Dark Lord, and this old allegiance would be used by Morgoth's successor as well. For throughout the Second and Third Ages, we see Sauron repeatedly use the East as a hiding place as well as a location to find followers. As Sauron begins to rise in the Second Age, the Valar send the two blue wizards to Middle-earth. And while their actions and final fate remain a mystery, Tolkien gives us two very intriguing possibilities. In his earlier writings, Tolkien envisioned the blue wizards arriving with the other three, traveling to the east and never returning. He also suspected that they failed at their duty to work against Sauron, and instead founded secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the Dark Lord's fall. However, in his later writings, in which they arrive in 1600 of the Second Age, the same year Sauron forges his One Ring, they travel to the east and the south. We are told they were never again heard or seen west of Mordor. In these writings, which appear in the History of Middle-earth volume, The Peoples of Middle-earth, we find the blue wizards are named Morinitar, which means Darkness Slayer, and Romestamo, meaning East Helper. During the Dark Years, where Sauron influences most of Middle-earth and makes war upon the Elves of Eriador, many men fall under his sway, and the East is no exception. He encourages the Easterlings during these years to go west to loot the other men of Middle-earth. This results in a war between the Easterlings and Orcs and the Northmen of Rhovanion. Also during these Dark Years, which encompasses much of the Second Age, Sauron gives a ring of power to an Easterling lord named Khamûl. With it, he gains great power among his people, becoming a mighty lord and sorcerer. This would, of course, come at an insurmountable cost, as he turns into a wraith, a slave to the power of the One Ring. Khamûl, who is the only Nazgul we know the name of, is the second greatest of his kind, surpassed only by the Witch King. We are told that while his ability to perceive the presence of the One Ring is only surpassed by the Witch King, his power was most confused and diminished by daylight. We know that Sauron frequently used men of the south and east alongside his orcs in his wars against the Free Peoples. But in the final chapter of the Silmarillion, we are told another race also allied with the Dark Lord. All living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even beasts and birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. They alone were undivided and followed Gil-galad. Of the dwarves, few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron. So while Durin's folk were firmly allied against Sauron, there were indeed dwarves who allied with the Dark Lord in this great war of the Second Age. It's highly likely that these dwarves were among the dwarves who lived in Rhûn. After Sauron's defeat by the Last Alliance in 3441, the lands of the East are freed from his tyranny. However, many still had darkness in their hearts, leading to battles between the groups of men within Rhûn. In the coming centuries, the Easterlings would bring war to the men who had played a large role in Sauron's defeat, the men of Gondor. Each of these attacks, battles, and even the brief period when Gondor conquers the westernmost land of Rhûn are detailed in my video on the Easterlings. As for Sauron, he was greatly weakened by his bodily defeat and the loss of his ruling ring. It is believed his spirit once again fled to the far east, where he sought to regain his strength. It would not be until 1,000 years into the Third Age that he could once again begin to take shape in a physical form. With this development, the Valar send wizards to aid the Free Peoples in their struggle against the Dark Lord. And if we're going by Tolkien's later writings, this is when the remaining 3 wizards reach the Grey Havens on the western coast of Middle-earth. Just 50 years later, Sauron would begin his re-emergence by settling in the former elven realm of Amon Lanc, which becomes known as Dol Guldur. Shortly after arriving in 1000 of the Third Age, a third wizard would make his way to the lands of Rhûn, Saruman the White. The leader of the Astari would spend the next 1,500 years in the east, the last 400 of which would coincide with Sauron's own time in the lands so often influenced by the Dark Lords. For in 2063, Gandalf investigates Dol Guldur, and the mysterious necromancer flees. Thus Sauron once again returns to the east, where he works to regain his power. Over the course of these 400 years, he rallies more Easterlings to his service, no doubt playing upon ancient alliances once more. During this time, Morinitar and Romestamo are tasked with finding where Sauron dwells in the east, but they are unsuccessful. Sauron returns to Dol Guldur as the Necromancer in 2460, and 3 years later, in 2463, Saruman is back in the Westlands of Middle-earth, and is named leader of the White Council. Whether Saruman ever met the Blue Wizards in his 1500 years dwelling in Rhûn, we can only guess. In 2793, dwarves of all 4 kingdoms of the east joined the other 3 dwarf clans in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. This war, prompted by the death of King Thror, is when Durin's folk seek retribution and reclamation of their ancient home of Khazad-dûm. After the war ends in 2799, the survivors of the 4 clans return home to their eastern halls. We would next hear of the dwarves of the east in the late Third Age. In the Fellowship of the Ring, we are told that as war and darkness grew once more in Rhûn, many of the dwarves of the east leave their ancient homelands, moving as far as possible from Rhûn to the Blue Mountains west of the Shire. Frodo Baggins meets some of these dwarves during their migration. Returning to the Blue Wizards, Tolkien also states that Morinitar and Romestamo play an important role in both the east and the south, and that their efforts ensure that Sauron's forces from these lands do not outnumber and overwhelm the men of the west, thus helping secure victory for the free peoples and Sauron's defeat. This suggests that there may indeed have been great battles between different groups of Easterlings. At the very least, it shows us that the Blue Wizards helped counter Sauron's efforts to recruit men of Rhûn under his banner. As we know, Easterlings would not only fight in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields at Minas Tirith, but they would also wage war upon the dwarf kingdom of Erebor and the men of Dale in the north. In both instances, they are ultimately defeated. While Sauron's defeat on March 25, 3019 is final, there would be lingering effects of his and Morgoth's evil throughout the lands of Rhûn. In Appendix A, we are told of some of Aragorn's final battles as King Elessar. In Gondor, the King Elessar now ruled, and in Arnor also. In all the lands of those realms of old, he was king, save in Rohan only, for he renewed to Éomer the gift of Cirion, and Éomer took again the oath of Eorl. Often he fulfilled it, for though Sauron had passed, the hatreds and evils that he bred had not died, and the King of the West had many enemies to subdue before the White Tree could grow in peace. And wherever King Elessar went with war, King Éomer went with him. And beyond the Sea of Rhûn, and on the far fields of the south, the thunder of the cavalry of the Mark was heard, and the white horse upon green flew in many winds until Éomer grew old. Thus the lands of western Rhûn would finally be subdued in the Fourth Age by King Elessar. As for the days to come, we are left to wonder what became of the inhabitants of the east. Would the Easterlings who had been loyal to Sauron finally be able to throw off the yoke of his influence? Would there be further war between the Easterlings loyal to Sauron and those who were not? Would the dwarves of Rhûn return to their ancient homes? And what became of the Blue Wizards? These are questions that remain of Rhûn, one of the most interesting yet mysterious of the realms of Middle-earth. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Listen Me the Cinda, Celebrimbor, The Mighty Mim, Team Weasel, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, Toby Mobs Music, CCDC Red Team, Nerd Sidgman Anytimer, Pelkey Sports Cards, Moki the Brown, Christopher Carbaugh, Joe Tepper, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Darracott, the Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.